International Bat Appreciation Day. Bats are international animals. There's 1,400 species of them. So there's a lot of bats to love and to learn about. Again, my name is Franny Preston. I'm the Invasive Species Outreach Coordinator here at UK. All right, so let's dive in. All right, so why do we need to care about bats? Why are we focusing on them? Why do we have a Bat Appreciation Day? Well, they need our help. So like I said, there's 1,400 bat species, or maybe even more, throughout the world. And unfortunately, a lot of them are in decline. I want to say about over 50% of them in the United States or within North America are in decline for different reasons. And we're going to talk about why. So 23 of them, of the 1,400 species worldwide, are critically endangered, which means they're really close to extinction, unfortunately. 85 of them are endangered, so they're getting on that way. 113 of them are vulnerable. And then 236 of these species don't really have enough data, so they might also be in dire straits. Now, why are bat populations declining so much? Well, for one, just like a lot of other wildlife and plant species, it's due to habitat loss. So different bats in different species, different areas, they're going to live in slightly different habitats. Of course, some of them are cave-dwelling species, some of them are forest-dwelling species and live in trees. But regardless, as human populations are growing and we're living in more areas, unfortunately, the natural areas where bats live are being taken away. This is an interesting one that I recently learned about. So bat populations are actually also declining because of wind energy. Now, wind energy and other renewable energy, of course, we want to have around. We want renewable energy to help stop things like climate change. But unfortunately, there's a downside to it. They're doing more research on how to make wind energy a little bit safer for bats. And the reason that it is dangerous is bats will run into these turbine blades. And you might be thinking, okay, bats are really good at echolocation. How are they running into these giant objects? Well, there's a couple different reasons. One of which, if they're migrating in big groups, they're not necessarily focused in, it might be dark outside and they simply don't see them. They don't know they're there, or the blades are moving too fast for them to calculate it. Or they might be hunting and they get too close to the blades and the air pressure can actually harm the bats just by being right next to the spinning blades. Bats might also try to roost in wind turbines because they're warm, or they just think that they're good structures to roost in and they get injured. And so thankfully they are doing some research on how to combat this. One of the ways that they can do that is by slowing the blades down at certain times of the year if bats are migrating through, or even certain times of the day if they know that they're most active in that area. All right, so we weren't going to get through a presentation without me talking about invasive species. So I'll start with how invasive wildlife are harming bats. And this is across the world, not just in Kentucky or the United States. First and foremost, cats. So I'm sure you have heard at this point about how cats are really detrimental to bird species. And they are unfortunately also very detrimental to bats as well. So cats can jump higher than you think, and so they might grab bats at night when they're flying around hunting low for insects, or they might climb trees and get them then. But regardless, please keep your cats inside. It's better for your cat and it's better for the bats as well. Now, some invasive species are competing with the bats for their food. An example of this is starlings, which are invasive here in the US, and they're eating some of the insects that the bats would eat. And goats is an interesting one, but again, a lot of bats will eat insects that rely on plants, and then the goats are eating the plants that the insects rely on, so it's messing up the whole food chain. Now, in rats, there are some invasive rats as well, and these will go and eat the bats. They'll climb into their roost and harm them. The same for some invasive snakes, and the same for some invasive fire ants as well. Now, invasive plants can harm bats as well. This one's a little bit more indirect, but definitely still having a problem. So invasive plants are non-native plants that are causing harm in an ecosystem. And one of the ways that they cause harm is that they outcompete native plants. And there are native insects the bats are eating that rely on the native plants. And so when the invasive species come through and wipe out a bunch of plants and decrease plant diversity, they decrease insect diversity, thus the bats are harmed. You might have heard of this problem that bats are facing, even here in Kentucky, and it is a pathogen called white nose syndrome. And it's a fungus that affects bat species, particularly ones that roost together in colonies because they're more tightly packed and it's spread a little bit easier. And what white nose syndrome does is it actually will keep the bats awake when they're supposed to be hibernating or wake them up a little bit earlier. And then they don't have the resources to keep up their energy needs. And unfortunately, that is decreasing bat populations as well. You can help with this by, if you are visiting caves, make sure to use all of the sanitation stations they have. Make sure you're cleaning off all of your equipment and sterilizing everything before you go to another cave. Another reason why bat populations are declining is because people will just kill them outright due to misunderstanding them. I don't know about you guys, but I have seen a lot of movies and TV shows that depict bats as villains. And I'll admit, if you've ever seen The Great Mouse Detective, that movie still scares me to this day because of the bat in it. Because they're always depicted as the villain, and it could be because they come out at night and they're just a little bit more mysterious to us because of that, or because people associate them with vampires. But regardless, we don't have anything to fear from bats. Again, a lot of them are just running around, flying around, eating bugs. And vampire bats, they're not in Kentucky, so you don't have to worry about those at all. And where vampire bats do exist, they don't turn into people, although that would be really interesting. And most of the time, they'll go after larger animals, which can include livestock. But again, most of the time, they're not attacking people. Another misconception that is widely spread about bats is that they carry rabies. And while they can carry rabies, it's a lower percentage than what people might think. And in the United States, on average, only 1.5 people per year contract rabies from bats. And most of the time, that's people who are constantly handling them, such as bat researchers. And you're way more likely to get rabies from a feral dog than a bat. So it's illegal to handle bats, but if you don't handle them, then you have a very, very low chance of getting rabies from bats. All right, so we talked about the reasons that their populations are declining, but why should we care about them? Well, bats, again, throughout the world, different species are going to have different roles in their ecosystems, and they all are very important. So I'll talk about the insectivores first. An insectivore just means they are insect eaters. So all of the bats that we have here in Kentucky are insectivores. They all only eat insects. I have pictured here a little brown bat, and it's very aptly named, and they can eat 1,200 insects an hour. So I don't know about you guys, but I like sitting outside on summer evenings, and I don't enjoy the mosquitoes. Now imagine we don't have any bats, and so there's quite literally nothing to eat the mosquitoes at night. How miserable that would be. And bats also control agricultural pest insect populations as well. And so they are very key insectivores to the environment because they kind of have the night shift of the insect eaters. In other parts of the world, bats are pollinators because some of them eat nectar, just like some birds or insect pollinators do. One of which, the one I have pictured, is a Mexican long-nosed bat. And this bat species really likes to get the nectar from agave plants. So if you like margaritas, you've got this bat to thank for pollinating it. They go in there and they get the pollen out. And while they do that, the pollen gets on their fur. They transfer it to another plant, just like a bird species would. And there are also fruit-eating bats, especially in warmer places like Australia or New Guinea. like the one I have pictured here. This is a giant golden crowned flying fox. And flying foxes are the biggest bat species in the world. They're really cute and they're really cool to look at too. But they like to eat fruit, such as figs. And so just like birds or other animals that eat fruit and then move to other places and poop it out, and then it spreads throughout the ecosystem, bats do the same thing. All right, so I've got listed here are Kentucky bats. And again, they are all insect eaters in Kentucky. We do have 14 bat species that are permanent or seasonal residents of Kentucky, but there are 16 total that have been recorded or are sometimes in Kentucky. Got them all listed here. And I have pictured here an evening bat. I took that picture. He was not thrilled that we were doing some research on him. But he looks like he's smiling anyways. We go back. Okay, so now we know why bats are in trouble and why we should care about them, but how should we go about doing that? Well, for one, we can garden for bats. And you might be thinking, okay, how am I supposed to garden for bats in Kentucky if none of them are eating nectar, none of them are eating fruit, they're all eating insects? Well, really, you're gardening for moths and other insects instead, but it's helping the bats out. So when you are outside, we were just talking about gardening before we started. When you're outside right now and you're thinking about maybe some new plants to add to your garden, you can think about helping the bats out as well by adding native plants. So you definitely don't want to plant plants that are on Kentucky's invasive plant list. But if you plant native plants, they're especially helpful because the insects that the bats are eating have interactions with these plants. They're specially adapted to them, and so they will attract those insects. And if you can plant a variety of them, that'll make your garden even more unique, and it'll attract a variety of insects for the bats. And if possible, reduce insecticide use. So again, the bats are there to eat the insects, so you don't need to use the insecticides anyway. All right, so again, we're going to kind of focus on moths for the next couple of slides and how you can attract moths because they're some of bats' favorite food. And if you are choosing some flowers to plant for moths in your garden, you can choose flowers that are pale or dull red, purple, pink, or white. I have pictured here common milkweed plant that fits that description. It's really great for a lot of pollinators, including hummingbird moths like this snowberry clearwing, which are really cool moths. And you can also choose flowers that have a strong, sweet smell. That's fun to have as well, especially when they're emitted at night, because that's what's going to attract the moths the best. And there are yucca plants that are native to Kentucky, and they have big white showy flowers, and they have a strong smell that's emitted at night, and they attract yucca moths, which are really cute, as you can see right there. They're little fuzzy white moths. All right, now let's say you've got your flowers picked out, but maybe you've got some larger space and you want to plant some shrubs or some trees. You can also think about planting some host plants as well for the larvae and the eggs of different moth species, because a lot of different pollinators and other insects, they don't just need the plants when they're adults for their nectar. They also need them for safety when they're eggs or for eating the leaves when they're growing up. Got a Cecropia moth caterpillar pictured here, and this guy was about that big, so he was pretty cool and is going to make a beautiful moth this spring. He is on a buttonbush plant, which is one of my favorite native plants, and they've also got some flowers that attract bees and butterflies as well. All right, so feel free to take a picture of this slide, but this is just a list of some different trees and shrubs and perennials, just suggestions for your Kentucky bat garden. You can also, I got this from wildones.org on their Southern Kentucky chapter website. They've got some really great resources for bat gardens in Kentucky as well. And all of these plants are native to Kentucky. All right, so we've got our beautiful bat gardens ready, but what else can we do for them? Well, if you're a woodland owner or you live near the woods, maybe your backyard is right up next to them, one thing that you can do in the fall is leave the leaves on the ground. So I know a lot of us will rake our leaves and send them away for aesthetic reasons, but the bats and other animals actually really need the leaves to stay there, especially when they're at the base of trees, including the eastern red bat, which in my personal opinion is the cutest bat that we have in Kentucky. I've got one pictured right there. And red bats will actually hang out on oak trees because they'll keep their leaves a little bit later in the fall than other trees. So you might be able to see them hanging on to leaves or right next to leaves in the fall. But they also will use the leaves at the base of a tree to kind of hibernate and stay warm as well. So if you're able to leave the leaves on the ground, even if it's just at the base of the tree, you can help out some bats. And you can also include some shagbark hickories. These are one of my favorite trees, but shagbark hickories and shellbark hickories and other trees with the big flaky bark that kind of flakes off are really great for some tree-dwelling bat species, such as the Indiana bat. And this is one of the 3 bat species in Kentucky that is endangered. And Indiana bats, they will actually hang out up in that bark, and that's where they roost. So it's pretty cool. And if you're hiking through your woodlands or hiking through a park and you see a shagbark hickory this summer, look up into the eaves and see if you can see one. All right. And we can also help out bats by building them houses or buying them houses. And you don't have to live next to the woods for this. I live in a suburban area in an apartment, and there was a bat outside of my house a couple days ago. So they are thankfully everywhere, eating the insects everywhere. And you should be able to have a bat house in your yard or attached to your house even. And a great resource for this is Bat Conservation International. They've got some really great resources to determining what size and shape and color bat house you need for the bat species in your area. And again, that's on Bat Conservation International. I took this at the Woodlands Nature Station. They've got some really great native plant gardens. And because of that, it attracts a lot of moths and other insects. And they've got some bat houses up as well. And almost 100 bats can fit in that little box. So they're doing a really great job. And I just took this picture because the vultures thought the bat houses were so great that they wanted to be a bat for a day too. All right, so I really appreciate you all learning about bats today. Hopefully on International Bat Appreciation Day, you got to learn a little bit more about them and learn why we should appreciate them. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask them now.